Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 472 for the 16th of Adar in a regular year. So I have a relative who started getting into studying Tanya several years ago, and he would come to me sometimes with different questions about the Tanya. You know, he was relatively new to the concepts, the ideas, and all of that stuff. And a while back, he approached me with actually a very interesting question, which was, how do I know where I'm at? Meaning to say that Tanya is all about the idea of getting close to God. You know, the premise of the Tanya, the thesis of the Tanya is that this thing is very near to you, to get close to God in your mouth and in your heart to do it. You know, that's how the Tanya starts off. So, so if the whole point of Tanya is to get you to be close to God, whatever that means, how do you know if you got there? How do you know if you're actually close to God? If you're closer to God than you were, if you're further away from God than you were before? How do you know where you're at? Like, how do you measure your progress? And I thought that was a really interesting question. And I realized after thinking about it for a while that it's actually kind of like a non-question. The answer to the question is that there is no answer. Because truthfully, the whole idea of Tanya, once you start getting into the study of the Tanya, is that you realize that it's not at all about levels at all. It's not about where you're at and your spiritual standing. Because if you get caught up in that kind of mentality, it actually becomes a very depressing endeavor. Because, again, the whole premise of the Tanya is that we are all Beinonim, and we're most likely always going to be Beinonim. And who is a Beinoni? A Beinoni is one who struggles. That's the definition of a Beinoni. And the struggle never ends. It really, really, really never ends. It's eternal, forever. There's always going to be this battle with your Yetzer Hara. So if you're hoping to one day win that battle, you won't. Sorry, spoiler alert. So once you realize that, you know, that can be a very depressing realization if you look at it in a certain way. When you realize that you will never be, you know, it's like sort of like a little kid who has like a dream of being a famous basketball player, but unfortunately he's really short and he never grows beyond a certain height. And he realizes at some point that, you know, at a certain point of his life, he realizes, you know, as much as he likes basketball and maybe he can play it for fun, for most of his life, he's never going to be in the NBA. He's not, you know, so that can be very depressing on the one hand, or as we'll eventually learn today, it can actually be very liberating when you shift your focus, when you realize that it's actually not about goals at all. It's not about like achieving a certain place. It's the purpose of life, the goal of life is in fact the struggle. And so that's going to be the theme of today's Tanya. And for context, we're beginning a new chapter 35 of Likkutei Amarim. And the first part of this section today, the Alter Rebbe is really going to delve into this existential angst. He's going to really give it attention because it is something that needs attention. We don't want to dismiss it. We want to realize that it's a real thing, and we want to realize that there's a stereotype of Jews being neurotic, and I think there really is something to that in the sense that when we come to realize this idea, the more you study Tanya, you realize that Jews have a real reason to be neurotic because we're not balanced people. We have within us these two souls. They're constantly at war. They're constantly battling, and we constantly have this existential angst. We're constantly divided in terms of our impulses, and we always feel unfulfilled. We always feel like we haven't reached our potential because we really haven't, and we never will. So on first glance, it's like when we realize this, that again, it sounds almost like Sisyphus. Sisyphus was this Greek character in Greek mythology who was cursed to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, and it was never going to get to the top of the mountain. He just had to keep pushing that boulder up the mountain. Like that, that almost seems like the definition of hell, of like the worst thing you can imagine ever is just fruitless labor. So is it just like, is that what life is all about? Is it just about this like fruitless labor? We know that this was also what the Egyptians did to the Jews in slavery. The greatest the worst part about the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt wasn't so much that they had them build pyramids and things like that, that obvious, and, do just hours of back-breaking labor and things like that. But the worst part is that they actually had them build cities that then they would smash down to the ground, and then they would have to build them back up again. And this would keep happening. So there's nothing worse than that, than putting in all this work, and then you realize that it's for nothing. So what is going on here? What is life all about? That is the question of today's episode. It's a very existential episode. Is what is the point of life? Is it just to struggle fruitlessly? What does God want from us? So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks all of this down. And as we'll see, the answer starts to become illuminated towards the end of this section today when we explore a teaching in the Zohar about this idea of a wise man having their eyes in their head, and what that means, and how this really is a teaching for us as to where we need to have our focus, and how when we shift our focus in the right place, this can really give us the answer to our problems, to this question. So once again, for context, we're beginning a new chapter today, chapter 35 of Likkutei Amarim. The answer is coming, and a little bit of a cliffhanger, as we'll see. And what came to mind for me in reading this chapter and thinking about how to give it over is a saying that I once believe that I read from Rav Yitzchak Ginsburg in Israel. If anybody wants to look this up or correct me, please do. Maybe it comes from other sources as well. But it was basically this idea that in order to really, truly understand Chassidus, a person needs to be disturbed about reality. So you often see this with like Balei Tshuva, people that come back to Judaism or something like that. People can kind of see this in a negative way, like, oh, maybe people are searching for religion because they're broken, because they need something in their life and they're not really together kind of people. That could be like a negative way of looking at it. But in a more positive way, if we want to focus more on the good side of it, is the fact that if a person's life is too comfortable, if a person doesn't really have a lot of troubles in their lives, or any kind of really serious troubles, like if they have it too good, they're not necessarily going to be the deepest people. So you often find people who have experienced trauma, abuse, all kinds of different things, or just life, really difficulties in life of any form, are often going to be the type of people that are really very deep, and really are often much more interesting to talk to, and have deeper understandings about reality and receptivity to philosophical discussions and stuff like that. So today's chapter is really going to be preparing us to be in that mindset. So while for some people that might come more naturally, like if people have experienced hardships in life, it kind of lends itself to start thinking about, why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? And we often find in different civilizations, sometimes the poorer civilizations, the third world countries, things like that, tend to be a lot more spiritual, because it's like when your physical reality isn't really treating you so well, it's normal to kind of turn to spiritual reality, versus if you get distracted with physical reality in the sense that you have all the cars and the houses and all that stuff, you're not necessarily, and let's say you have good family life and relationships and everything like that too. Like, why would you search? Why would you find anything else? So today's portion is really going to bring us into that existential crisis and explain to us what existential crisis we should all be grappling with, even if, thank God, hopefully some of us have had pretty good lives, hopefully. So even if a person has had this kind of good upbringing or whatever it is, or if they haven't, really for anybody, then the Alter Rebbe is going to kind of give us guidance as to what the existential crisis should be. What is the basic question that we should all be grappling with reality. And that basic question is, why are we here? Obviously, the most famous question of all times. And we can especially appreciate this question in light of everything we've learned so far about the character of the Beinoni, who this book is written for, and this whole idea that we've talked about how life is struggle, how we never really win the battle. And we talked a little bit about the idea that it's really more about the process and it's about the struggle and all of that. But the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying in this chapter that we're going to be learning that that's really not enough. And really, ultimately, it's like we really should be asking, what is the point? Why? Why do we have this struggle? Why couldn't God just make things easy? And so with that said, let's get straight into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down. And here we go. So for chapter 35, so the Alter Rebbe brings up a pasuk, a verse, which he sort of set as his mission statement for this entire book, which is a verse from Devarim, chapter 30, verse 14, which was that this thing, meaning this service of God, serving God, getting close to God, is very near to you in your mouth and in your heart to do it. So now here, the Alter Rebbe wants to really focus on this word, to do it. And so he says to continue explaining this idea, this wording of to do it, to serve God in actuality, and also to understand a little bit, like a small glimmer of the purpose of the Beinoni and why their souls came down here into this world to become clothed in the animal soul, which comes from the klipa, as we described, those husks, and the sitra achra, the other side. Even though we know, and as we've learned, they will never be able to eradicate it their entire lives and to push it out of its place in the left ventricle of the heart. So for a Beinoni, as we mentioned, it's constant struggle. A Beinoni, once again, to recall, to bring to mind what a Beinoni is, this is a person who never, ever, ever goes against the will of God in thought, speech, or action. This is somebody who, in colloquial sense, people often call it tzaddik, but the Beinoni isn't so lax with that term, and he says this is merely a Beinoni, and the reason why they are a Beinoni and not a tzaddik is because there's a constant fight. They may be behaving properly, but the evil within them, the evil inclination is still there, very much present, very much alive in the left ventricle of the heart. And it's a constant fight to push it down so that all kinds of different thoughts and meanderings will not rise up into the mind. So even in the mind, so Beinoni is the type of person who has to have control over their thoughts. So the second that like an impulse to think a certain thing that's not the most positive thing comes up, the Beinoni has to squash it down and push it down. And the Alter Rebbe reminds us that this is because the essence and the being of the animal soul that comes from the klipos is in such a strong way. It's still totally intense and in its full strength, just as if they were born. So the Beinoni fights throughout their life and is engaged in this perpetual battle. But even after all of this time of battling, their negative inclinations are they're just as strong as before. So it's like, what really has the Beinoni accomplished through this fight is basically what the Alter Rebbe is getting at. And he says that it's just that they are not vested within their body, as we explained above. So it's like the negative impulses are there. It's just that the Alter Rebbe doesn't allow them to become vested within his body. And so thus, here's the question that the Alter Rebbe says. Why did their soul come down into this world in order to strive for nothing, God forbid? It seems like really nihilistic. Like it seems like it's all for naught. Like they're just fighting and fighting and fighting all of their days with this negative inclination, and that they're never able to vanquish it. So again, it sounds like that Sisyphus example that we gave of the Greek king who's pushing that boulder up a mountain, and it's like it's never going to get there. So like, what's the point? What is the point of it all? And then the Alter Rebbe says that this should be their comfort. So here he gives a little bit of an answer, which is that their comfort should be in a doubled measure to assist and to gladden their heart over God who dwells with them in their Torah and in their service. So basically the Alter Rebbe is saying that what we're going to be exploring is we're going to be talking about this idea of how there is a rejoicing that a person can have in spite of this seeming existential angst and like kind of nihilistic view of life in recognizing that God is with us in our Torah and our service. And so really, what we need to do, if we want to solve the riddle of this existential angst, is to shift our focus elsewhere. Where is that elsewhere that we want to shift our focus? So the key to that and the clue to that is in a verse from Kohelet chapter 2 verse 14, which says Hechacham enav berosho, which literally translates as the wise man's eyes are in his head. And now this section of the Tanya has a lot of Aramaic to it. So I definitely needed the translation to get through it today. I'm not fluent in Aramaic. And so I'm going to be kind of going through the text with you, but also explaining it at the same time. So usually if you've been following on the podcast, I at some point or another, I kind of go through a more literal translation. Today, I'm going to be kind of like going through the text, but interjecting commentary along the way. So the basic idea, so we're getting into it now. So the basic idea is that, so starting off with this verse, the wise man's eyes are in his head as a way of understanding and having a clue to this understanding of how to solve this existential angst is, so the Alter Rebbe cites the Yenuka, which is in the Zohar. So the Yenuka was actually, he was a child prodigy who is oftentimes cited in the Zohar. He was from the village of Sichnin, and he was the son of Rav Hamnuna Saba. So it's just anybody who's interested in that. And so the Yenuka, so he asks a question on this verse of a wise man's eyes are in his head. He says, this is a weird thing to be saying, especially Kohelet is supposed to be this book that's filled with all this wisdom, the wisdom of King Shlomo and things like that. Saying a wise person's eyes are in their head, I mean, isn't everybody's eyes in their head? Like where else would your eyes be? Like your eyes are not in your feet, right? Your eyes are not in your stomach. So what does that mean? So the Yenuka says that in order to really understand what this means, a wise man's eyes are in their head, we have to look at the fact that first of all, there's this idea of men wearing head coverings. You see Jewish men, they wear a yarmulke, a kippah, or some type of head covering. And the reason for this is because there's this understanding that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests above a person's head. And so the Yenuka explains that when we say that a wise man's eyes are in their head, we don't mean inside of their head, and we don't mean like physical eyes. We mean that their focus is on their head. It's above their head. It's focusing on the Shekhinah, on the light of the Shekhinah. So now what does this mean? So there's this idea that comes up a lot in Torah, in Judaism, in Kabbalah, in Chassidus, that man is likened to a candle. And the way that works is that we say that a man's body is the wick, and then the soul, or the Shekhinah, which rests above their head, is considered to be the flame of that wick. And so if you think about a physical candle, in order to keep a physical candle, in this case, we're talking about like an oil candle, to continue to keep it burning, it needs oil. So if you want to keep that fire burning, you need to consistently feed it with constant oil. And then as kind of like a proof for this understanding of this idea of the oil and the Shekhinah and above the head and everything like that, the Yenuka quotes another verse from Kohelet, this time from chapter 9, verse 8, which says, V'shemen al roshcha al yichasar, which literally means that let there be no lack of oil above your head. This is something that King Shlomo said. So it's, again, this idea that we are supposed to constantly be putting oil, nourishing our soul or the Shekhinah above us with oil. What does this mean? What is oil? Oil is understood to mean good deeds. So what this basically means on a very simple level is that when we say that the wise man's eyes are in his head, it's not teaching us literally something that we all know. Every child knows this, that your eyes, where are your eyes? Your eyes are in your head. Is it saying that a wise person, their focus is not inside of their physical body and inside of this struggle and this animalistic battle that's going on within them, but it's upwards. It's up towards the Shekhinah, towards the divine presence, and it's focused on constantly nourishing the flame, constantly providing it with oil, with good deeds, in order to keep the fire burning. And this is the end of the teaching of the Zohar. This is the end of the section for today. And we're going to keep going with this tomorrow, but just so far, what we've learned is that, yes, existential angst is a real thing. And there's a reason why we have this existential angst, because we truly do have these two souls inside of us, these two impulses that want polar opposite things. And this will never be resolved. And it truly will never be resolved. So the solution to this is to stop focusing so much on the inside. I mean, yes, we need to, we need to acknowledge that there's a battle there and we need to fight the battle for sure. But the motivation, the sort of like our North Star, our orientation should be on something higher, should be upwards to the oil, so to speak, which is the good deeds that they perform. in spite of the internal battle that's going on, the perpetual battle that's going on. So we're going to get deeper into these ideas tomorrow when we continue with this chapter. So stay tuned, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.